happy that, you know, in the end, this terrible situation is also giving us the courage to do more, you know, easier, let's say, communication than it was before, because to organize something like this in a face-to-face situation is a little bit more complex. So thank you
Yes.
for everyone for joining. So I can see that there is Lucas de Muelaner. That's a very difficult name for me.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Okay, now it's actually one of the problems will be that, of course, we're giving this for an Italian audience. So I would like in maybe a couple of minutes to ask everyone if they want me to translate into Italian, because that, you know, maybe we can avoid it, or maybe I will just translate what you say.
You mean slide by slide?
Yeah, well,
For
I
me,
will
there's
translate what you say mainly.
For me,
Thank
there's
you,
no need
Tudor,
to.
for helping us.
For me, it's good also without translation.
Yes, the same. I agree.
I can see
Okay, in English.
Giancarlo. Can you? Is everyone online? Is anyone online wanting us to translate? I mean, just, you can also say it in the chat if you would prefer.
Or you can put it. There's also the yes button. If you say yes, we know for you English is fine.
Okay, lots of people connecting right now. So I will start. Thank you, Luc, again, and thank you, Evi, and thank you, Lucas, and thank you, Tudor, for helping us organize. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Luc Int Panis, I never know how to pronounce your name, but is a you know, very well-known researcher all over Europe on air quality, and has been working a lot on monitoring mobility impacts. How would you describe it? I don't know, but he will explain to you more what he's been doing. I would like to repeat, if anyone on this webinar would want us to translate into Italian, I will do it with no problem. So just send us in the chat a comment that you want the translation in case, okay? So I'll leave the floor to Luc and to his presentation.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you everyone for inviting us. Of course, we would have preferred to come to Milan in person and do this presentation on a stage, but we're very happy that we can do it this way. So I will be talking mainly about whether cycling in a city is healthy. And most of the results, or many results that I will show, are results of the European PASTA project. And you can see behind me here the logo. So whenever you see the logo in my presentation, you know this is the result of the European project. Let me now try to share my screen with you. And the question is therefore very simple: is urban cycling healthy or not? So let's look at some research results from this European project. And I'm especially relying on results from this project because it was a large study done in a lot of different cities that have similarities, but also differences. For example, Rome was one of those cities where there's a lot of private motorized transportation. My own city, Antwerp, also has large share of cycling, for example. So by studying all of these cities together and coming to one conclusion, we think that the conclusions that we are presenting, they are reliable and they can be applied in other cities in Europe as well.
Luc, can you just, are we recording?
Yes, we are. We are recording.
You are?
Yeah, we are recording.
Just, I'm sorry because I wasn't sure. Sorry, excuse me.
Okay, so let me begin by some good news, which a lot of people find interesting. We found that cycling makes you thinner. So we all know that cycling has multiple benefits, but one of the studies we did in PASTA was we looked at the weight of people, or rather the body mass index. And then we found that, and you can see that in the top right graph, that people who frequently cycle are skinnier, lower body weight than people who only cycle occasionally or not at all. Now that is a result that many people have already found, and then you can also say the exact opposite. You can say, well, but it's skinny people that ride bikes, because if you're too fat, you cannot ride a bike. So that is no proof. And that is why in PASTA, we also followed people for approximately 2 years. And we looked not just whether they were cycling, but we also looked at whether they kept cycling the same amount or whether they increased cycling or less cycling. And then we found the same result. So it's actually, even if you're cycling and you start to cycle more, then you get even skinnier. So we thought that was a nice and interesting result that perhaps for some people is more convincing than health. So having a nice figure. So that's where you should look at the slide. Okay, another nice result from the PASTA project is that cycling is also good for mental health. So we looked at self-perceived health, mental health, social contact, etc. And this was one of the major results of PASTA, or one of the results that got into the media. And there were lots of websites and newspapers that were reporting about the mental health benefits of cycling. So that's another benefit that is not often talked about, but which we think is very important. And even last week, this paper was shared on social media quite often, because now people start to suffer mental health consequences of the lockdown. And in some countries like Belgium, cycling is really advocated, and people say you should go out to walk and cycle. It's good for your health, but especially for your mental health. And this is why last week this paper was shared around the world on all kinds of websites. Okay. Despite all the benefits that there are to cycling, there is one problem that always bothers everyone in all languages in Europe. Everyone worries about air pollution, because if I'm cycling, I'm inhaling air pollution. And then if you believe the newspaper, then this should be very unhealthy and cause all types of problems. So of course, we also did research on air pollution and if that has effect on people. I found even this recent article in Italian about the problem of air pollution. So what kind of studies do? We actually give people a little instrument, and that is the little blue box you see. It's about as large as your wallet, so you can easily take it with you. There's a very small filter in there, also a very small laser. And so air is drawn over this filter. It turns black. It measures black carbon. So the filter becomes ever blacker, and that is what we measure with the laser. So we can, like every couple of seconds, we can know the exact concentration of black carbon or soot, if you want, that people are experiencing. So the graph that you are seeing is from a study done by Evi a couple of years ago. And we had 3 instruments. One instrument people kept in front of their house. One instrument was given to the husband of the family, and the other one to the wife in the family, each having their own agenda. And what you see in the results is that concentrations that people experience throughout the day, they can be very different. And especially when people are driving a car, these concentrations are very high. But also, for example, when someone is riding a bicycle, occasionally there are also high peaks of black carbon that people can experience. So if we do that for many people during several weeks or months, and we sum it all up, then we see that the exposure to black carbon of different types of road users is a bit different. And we can see that the exposure is highest for people using cars and lowest for people walking, cycling, or taking a train. But we can also see that there is a lot of variation. So there are sometimes very high peaks, up to 20,000 nanograms or 20 milligrams, which is really a lot. So you can see that there is a huge difference there. Of course, the concentration in the air is not the only thing that counts. Also, the amount of physical activity that you're doing, that is what determines how much of this black carbon actually enters your lung. So if we now look at the dose, the amount of black carbon that we get into our lungs, then we see a completely different picture. And then we see that the dose that cyclists are experiencing, that is the highest. Then that is, of course, because cyclists are doing physical activity. They are breathing at least 4 or 5 times more air than when they would be resting. And therefore, the dose is always higher for cyclists than for car drivers. So that is, I always say that's an inconvenient truth. There was long discussion whether the concentrations were higher in cars or on bikes, but it's actually the dose that counts. So that's a bit of bad news. The question is, of course, if we inhale as a cyclist air pollution in traffic, does that have negative consequences for our health? And there is not much research being done into that. Here's one paper from 2004 that was in the New England Journal of Medicine. And they looked at people that were admitted to hospital with a heart attack. And they asked people, what have you been doing in the hours before the heart attack occurred? And I'm just here looking at transportation. And one of the risk factors they found was having driven a car. So if you drove a car, then your risk of having a heart attack in the 1 hour after driving a car was 2.6 times higher. So that's a serious risk. If I look a bit further down the table, having been on a bicycle in traffic increased the risk of a heart attack by a factor of 4. So this was a very strange result. So people driving a bike would have a higher risk of suffering a heart attack after driving in traffic, even more than people driving a car. Now, if you read the entire paper, then the authors themselves say, we're not sure this is just the air pollution. This may also be stress. Also, cyclists experience stress in traffic because it may be dangerous. So this is often cited as an example of a study showing that air pollution is unhealthy for cyclists. But if you read the entire paper, then it's not so clear that this result would be due to air pollution. There are other studies. This is a recent study done in Hong Kong, and they looked at blood pressure and the health of the lungs in people that were jogging in the city of Hong Kong, which is a big city. And they saw that people doing physical activity in the city, they had higher blood pressure, which is usually a bad sign. And this was also due to the polluted route. So if you choose a cleaner route, then the effect was smaller than having a clean route. And also many other studies. We looked at school children, we looked at the veins, the blood veins in the eyes. We also looked at the big artery on the side of the neck, the one that goes up to your head, to your brain. And so we find that every way we look at it, if you are exposed to air pollution, and especially black carbon, this has an effect on your blood vessels. So it's not a surprise that then the health effects are mainly cardiovascular. So these are effects on the heart rather than effects on the lungs. So people think we breathe air pollution. This must be unhealthy because it enters through our lungs. But we see that for air pollution, okay, the air pollution enters lungs, but it's especially the heart and the blood veins that suffer from it. So it leads to high blood pressure and it increases the risk of triggering a heart attack. Also, which air pollution, which particles are the most dangerous? This is from another study from Belgium. And this is, as far as I know, the only study that looked at all of the different sizes of particles. And no surprise, it is the smallest particles, those in the 20 to 30 nanometer range. So that's even smaller than a coronavirus. Those increased the blood pressure. And that was very clear. So it's the ultrafine particles or the black carbon that is triggering the blood pressure effect, and not the PM10 or the PM2.5 that is usually measured by official networks in cities. Okay, so we did an experiment in Brussels, which is a polluted city, as you know, and also the same experiment near Vito, which is the institute where I work, and we are in a forest. So this is the cleanest place in all of Belgium. And we had a lot of volunteers that were inactive. They did no physical activity, and they agreed to do this start to run program. So 12 weeks, 3 times per week, they started running, doing this training exercise. And we looked at their health before the training. And then after 12 weeks of training, we went to look whether they had become healthier or not. So 2 groups, one in the polluted city, one in the clean area, and then we look whether their health improves from the physical activity. And we looked at all kinds of things, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but we looked, for example, at their lungs, the exhaled NO. We did all kinds of analysis on their blood cells, white blood cells, etc. And most interesting in this study was we also looked at cognitive tests. So how well is your brain working? How fast can you react, and can you give reliable answers to trick questions? So those are the cognitive computer tests. And what we found, all kinds of results. White blood cells increase, so immediately the body responds to air pollution, trying to fight it off. And the nicest result of this study is this Stroop color word test, which is one of the cognitive tests. So it tests how well your brain works. And the people that did this physical activity in the clean area, they had improved. So suddenly they were able to do this test better than before after the training. But in Brussels, where people did the same training and they had all of the same health benefits, they didn't have this health benefit for their brain. So this is not really a health effect, but it's a beneficial effect that you don't have if you train in the city. And we wrote a paper about that, and we were very scientific about it, not trying to exaggerate the results. And then, of course, all of the newspapers were writing crazy things like jogging outside could make you stupid and suffer mental health problems. That's then what the newspapers write. And this is, of course, the opposite of what we were trying to say. So it doesn't make you stupid. If you do it in clean air, it may make you smarter, and you're not likely to suffer mental health problems, quite the opposite. Okay, back to the lungs a bit. Before we started the PASTA study, I only knew this study. This was for people suffering from asthma. And if they went for a walk in London, you could immediately see that the volume of their airways, so the volume of their lungs, their lung function, immediately went down. And even after the end of the walk, they had like 5% lower lung function, these asthmatics. And this only happened when they were walking in Oxford Street. And if you know London, Oxford Street is a busy street, but it only has buses and taxis. So all of the traffic on Oxford Street is diesel. There's no petrol cars there. And this was compared with the walk in Hyde Park, which is a very big park. So almost no local air pollution there. This is the only study that I know that specifically looks at diesel. In all of the other studies, like the one from Brussels that I just explained, yeah, there are diesel vehicles, there are petrol vehicles, there are two-stroke vehicles, there's heating, there's all kinds of sources of air pollution. This is one study that shows the effect of diesel emissions, in my opinion, or mainly diesel emission. So we wanted to replicate that in PASTA, and we also looked at lung function. So this is this FEV1, that is the amount of air that you can blow out in 1 second, if you've ever done that with a doctor. And all of the participants in PASTA, they were mainly healthy people that are already physically active. That is the reason they wanted to participate in the project. So we didn't think they would have additional benefit of exercising even more. And yet you can see at the left side of the graph, even these healthy people, if they exercise even more than they were already doing, they have a small extra benefit for their lungs. But if they do this in polluted environments, like more than 1.5 micrograms like carbon per cubic meter, and that was in many cases in Barcelona, in London, and I guess in Rome as well. So many cities have concentrations above 1.5. And then you can see that these healthy people, if they exercise more, they lose lung volume. So losing lung function is not something that only happens in children or in asthmatics. It's also something that can happen with healthy adults that are already physically active. Okay, so there can be effects on your brain, there can be effects on your heart, there can be effects on your lungs, and this all sounds like bad news, but I have to stress that all of these effects that we found, and we're very proud that we can find these, we are scientists, and then we write papers about this, but all of these effects are very small. And the most important effect is the benefit of physical activity. You do physical activity, your lungs improve. You do physical activity, your heart improves. All kinds of things improves. And this improvement due to the physical activity is much, much, much larger than the small effects that you have from inhaling the air pollution. And the most important risk to your health when you're cycling, in all of these studies, and I've listed here like more than a dozen studies, the largest risk for your health is not the air pollution, it's accidents. So that is why my conclusion is always, don't worry about air pollution. Yeah, we should worry about air pollution and we should take it away wherever we can. So keep cycling, but please only when it's safe. Because if you die from cycling, it will be from an accident and not from the air pollution. So the physical activity is by far the most important thing, the benefits. Okay, which means that we need more people to get cycling. And how do we get people to cycle? We have to build infrastructure. And there is a nice relationship between the number of cycling paths or the length of cycling paths in cities. And for example, Antwerp and Bruges are cities where there's a lot of cycling infrastructure. And then you see that they have approximately 25% mode share of cyclists, of all the traffic. And then there are other Belgian cities like Brussels that are not doing quite so well. So they have fewer infrastructure and fewer cyclists. And then for your information, I've added Rome, and Rome is down there. So I think for Rome, there's still room for improvement. You can also see that, of course, just the length of the cycling infrastructure doesn't explain anything. There are, for example, up here, Dutch and German cities that have a 40% cycling mode share, and still they don't have exactly the infrastructure that some of the other cities have. If you build this infrastructure, it has benefits for the health of the people using it. And if you express that in money, if you express health in euros, then the return on investment is, for all of the calculations that I've seen, between 2 and 14. That means if you build a cycling highway and it costs 1,000 euros, then the benefit for health will at least be 2,000 euros. So building it is almost always a good idea. Now, to help you with that calculation, PASTA has cooperated with the World Health Organization. And there is a tool which is called HEAT, the Health Economic Assessment Tool. And if you are not a health expert and you're not an economist and you think that everything that I've talked about is very difficult, you can still use this tool yourself. You just click, you enter a couple of values, there's a guide, and it will tell you for the project that you're thinking about. This may be a scheme to encourage people to cycle, or this may actually be building something like a cycling path or a bridge. Then this tool will calculate exactly how much health this will gain. And you will see that this is always higher than the cost of building it. And we think this is a tool that can help you convince policymakers that are used to thinking in euros, help them convince that it's actually worth the money. And of course, there's a nice user guide. It's all very transparent. It's not hocus pocus. And this is something with very little help everyone can do for themselves. So thank you for your attention with my presentation. We are on Twitter. You can email us if you want more information. And I want to point out that Francesco Iacarossi, who is also on Twitter, was the most important Italian in the PASTA project, and he can tell you much more about our results fluently in Italian as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Luc. Really very, very interesting and well informed presentation. I actually would like to take the opportunity to split between Luc and Evi the time and give the word to Lucas de Muelaner because he's the counselor to the Brussels government environment, or maybe I'm not sure how am I defining it, but he's working anyhow to improve environment in the Brussels region. So it's let's say on the side of policy making and working, I assume, hard to improve the air quality and environment in Brussels.
Yes,
So,
thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So basically, I just wanted to take the opportunity because I received the invitation maybe an hour ago, but I thought it would be interesting for me to participate because I like discussing with scientists about this topic, but I also can tell you a bit more about what we do at the policy level, at the political level to improve air quality and to take and what the current sanitary I mean the current health situation has impact on mobility in Brussels. So maybe it can interest you. So I prepared like in 5 minutes something to tell you, so I won't be long, but I'm happy to answer questions. And I think it can be also an interesting introduction for the second speaker. So basically in Brussels, what we saw during the government had to take quick action to tackle the coronavirus crisis. And so what we could see is that due to the fact that people had to stay at home, one element was removed. I mean, mostly one, it was mobility. And air pollution could drastically improved. I mean, the air pollution dropped a lot. So we could see, for example, that the concentration were between 40% to 90% lower than in a normal day. So we can really see that in Brussels, the problem is cars, and diesel cars in particular. So I think, I mean, the conditions, the meteorological conditions also had an impact on this very sudden drop. But you cannot have a 90% decrease just with good weather. So I think that's a very interesting thing that we can see all around the world, but that we will try to keep in mind for the months to come. For example, again, for a quick number, the number of cars moving in Brussels dropped from 50 to 75%. So it's the most. It's the most pristine conditions for a scientist to study the impact of mobility on air pollution, I think, because from one day to the next, you had no more cars in the street. So it's quite an interesting lessons to learn. So what did we do in Brussels? Our minister for mobility. So I'm working for the minister for environment. So it was not my minister, but I can tell you a bit more about what she did. She started by adapting the traffic lights to give more time to pedestrians and cyclists to cross the streets, because people can still move around with their bicycles in Brussels, because it's one way to respect the social distances. So we try to make sure that people can move around more freely with their bikes and to give them priority. Secondly, she also sent a letter, because you know Brussels is a bit, Belgium is complicated, but Brussels is complicated as well. We have one mobility minister, but also 19 municipalities that also have their say in how we develop our mobility plans. So what she did is she immediately sent them a letter to ask them, you know, if you need support to improve the conditions for the pedestrians and for the cyclists, just give me a call, just send me the streets where you need help, and we'll find a solution. And what she said is she suggested them to do 3 things for pedestrians and cyclists. First, to implement slow streets. So basically, slow streets is a street where the pedestrians and the cyclists have priority over the cars, and they can move at maximum, the cars can move at maximum 20 kilometers per hour. So you can really see that, for example, now in Brussels, you can see kids, you can see families moving around with their bikes in security, because of course there are less cars, but also because the cars have to be a bit more careful. We put some pots, some flower pots a bit in the streets to, you know, to force the cars to slow down, because of course it's easy to put just a sign, but you also have to make sure that people respect them. So we put like flower pots. There are some pictures online if you look for them. I can send them as well, but it was quite interesting to see that people started to see the streets, and some of the streets differently. She also suggested mayors to implement bicycle streets. So bicycle streets, again, is a street where the bicycle is king and the cars have to wait behind them. And she also told them, you know, if you have other ideas, so for example, if you need money or means, I mean, technical means to have more pedestrian crossings, like temporary bicycle lanes and stuff like that, that she was available. And what we can see is that more and more, this letter was sent 10 days ago, and in a week, she already had 8 municipalities that answered her call. Some of them even suggesting like 30 different streets to have them in slow streets, to have them more nicer for the pedestrians and for the cyclists. So there is really a big movement in Brussels at the moment. And a few hours ago, I think 5 hours ago, we had the first temporary bicycle lane that was put in place. So basically it was a big street in Brussels, one of the, like, I think there are 5 car lanes there. And we couldn't really, there was never a political agreement to remove car lanes there. And now just like in an afternoon, it happened, there is temporary bicycle lane. So I think it's quite interesting to see that we can see it now, that cars are a problem in Brussels. People can see it with their own eyes. So I'm not saying that all these streets will stay as is in the future, but I think it's an interesting experience. So I don't know who is in this webinar actually, but I would encourage you to contact your ministers to share the word. I mean, there are lots of good examples. Brussels is not the only street doing that at the moment, but I think it's quite nice to see that, and I think people will keep cycling in the months to come as well. So maybe to start to talk a bit more about what we will do in the months to come. So we are planning to continue having more bicycle lanes. I mean, we call them corona pistes because the idea is to help people move around respecting the safety distances. But of course, we also think about the fact that some of them could stay in the future. So it's good also. We are thinking about what we could do, what could stay in the future, what would be useful for people. Where are people moving around? Because we see a lot of people, you know, in Brussels, some places are not very green. So people are in the streets because they want to take some fresh air, but there is no green zones. So we are thinking about putting some temporary green zones for the summer as well, because we can see already that it's possible that people in Belgium will not be able to go out of the country this summer, or not as much as they would want to. So we want to offer them some nice opportunities to live in their city. And so I think that's also an opportunity for citizens to see their city in another way. So maybe I told you it was a good introduction for the next speaker, because one piece of advice that I can also give you is that involving citizens in measuring air quality is important. So Mr. Int Panis talked about a project where people moved around with devices measuring air pollution, and we had that in Brussels. And some of these projects, so we had several of these projects, and some of them led to the creation of citizen groups that started to ask for a cleaner air. And you know, a few months after these projects, you could see citizen actions that were organized by these groups, and it had a huge impact on the elections. And I think that's why I'm today here talking to you as the advisor of a green minister, because people started to block the streets. So we had like hundreds of schools blocking one day for an hour, one day a week, the street in front of their school to ask for a cleaner air. And why did they do that? Because they had measured air pollution in their street, and they started to realize, you know, air pollution has an impact on my kids, and that's the strongest incentive you can give people to change. So I would say, I don't know again who is in this webinar, but if you have the opportunity to involve citizens in that type of projects, it's definitely a good idea, because in Brussels, that's one of the elements that led to the fact that, for example, now in our government agreement, it is planned to phase out diesel cars by 2030. So it's in 10 years. It's still far away, but it's still one of the most ambitious plans we have in Europe. And petrol cars will be banned by 2035. So again, it's not the best case scenario. We would want to phase them out today and tomorrow, but it's something quite ambitious that we are working on, and that should be implemented, that will be implemented this year. So yeah, that's basically it from my side. I'm happy to answer questions, but I just wanted to give you a practical impact that coronavirus can have on mobility in cities. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lucas. Actually, we are a group of, we are an NGO, and we're just coming out of our third edition of monitoring NO2 with tubes, and probably a lot of people that are in this webinar have participated in our monitoring campaigns for that this year occurred in Milan, Rome, and Naples. And actually, it's kind of weird because in Milano, we had the lockdown just in the middle of our campaign. So probably our data will have quite a relevant how can I say, impact will be impacted rather heavily by the lockdown, but we'll take in good account this also. I was just wondering, how do you handle the parking issue in Brussels? Because this is quite a hot topic in Italy.
It's the same in Brussels. I mean, if you ask me, the price for a parking spot is way too low in Brussels, and we are way too permissive with that that element in particular, because I think if you want to reduce car use, you have to tackle parkings first. That's the priority. But of course, it's difficult because people are always reluctant to give up their parking spot. Huh? But more and more, we are trying to, you know, for example, now at the moment, we are working on a legal text where there are legal requirements. There is a minimum amount of parking space that you have to build when you build a new house. When you build a new building, you have to have, like, I don't know the numbers because it's far in my head, but it's like maybe X amount of parking spots per houses or per apartment or something like that. And we are trying to tighten that, you know, to make sure that there are less and less of these parking spots that are built. I know that in the years to come, we will also try to increase the prices of parking in Brussels. But again, that's a highly political issue. So I think it will happen, but I know it will be a hard battle. But again, if I can come back to the coronavirus crisis, these slow streets that we implemented, we removed the cars to have them there, you know. So the cars, we took them away. We told them, you know, you have to move, and so there was a huge space that was available. So and we can see that in some of these streets, people are walking on the street because they see that it's a free public space. So I think you need to show them that parking is something that can be something else than just asphalt. Huh? But I mean, it's easy to say and maybe harder to do.
We actually have two questions for you, which is one, how do the trade shoppers and trade unions reacted to your interventions in the city, and if the parking is by residents is paid or not in Brussels? I mean, do you as a resident pay the parking?
To be honest, I have no idea. I work for the Minister of Environment, so it's not really my topic. So I will not tell you something wrong. I wouldn't want to mislead you. And how did people react? At the moment, there are mostly positive reactions because people are at home and they just want to breathe some fresh air. So at the moment they use the streets, and also there are no cars in the streets, so it's very easy. There is no congestion. But I guess that at some point, you know, the big streets I was talking about with 5 car lanes, when you will remove one, it will definitely create congestion if the situation comes back to what it was before the crisis. And that's what we want to make sure to prevent. We want to help people to change the way they move. So we have to offer them infrastructure before they start realizing that the world is back to normal. Huh? We have to make people keep cycling, and we have to make sure that, as Luc said a bit earlier, that it's safe for them to cycle, because otherwise they just will stop. So we hope that they will not shout too much, and we will do our best to do that, because that's why the minister sent a letter to all the municipalities, you know, to make sure that they are on her side. And so she only does what the municipalities ask them, and it's already a lot, huh? Because all of them see that there is a potential. So I think there is a way to at least keep some of them after the crisis, and that would be already a big win.
Thank you so much, Lucas. I'm just wondering if anybody would want to ask questions to Luc before we go on to Evi, or to more questions in general. Just if you have any queries on the presentation of Luc. I know I have one, but I would like to ask at the end. So if nobody has more questions, shall we go on with Evi, and then maybe we come back to a general discussion. I'm sure we'll have many more questions for everyone.
Okay.
Yes, okay. Thank you. I will try to share my screen now. Just a second. Sorry. Yes. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about walkers and cyclists, but I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about well, probably the biggest citizen science project in the world about air pollution. And it was in Belgium. It was actually in Flanders, which is the northern part of Belgium, which has about 6 million inhabitants. And we did measurements on 20,000 sites, or actually citizens did the measurements on 20,000 sites. And why? Well, why did this project start? Well, Luc has already mentioned, well, actually the protests of people, even children coming out on the street protesting against, in front of their schools because of bad air. They had these pamphlets saying, I want clean air. It was actually also a television show that measured soot particles inside the urine of these children. And it got into the media, and people were really a bit frustrated about, well, having bad air, and even children have to breathe this air. So actually it's kind of a big issue in Belgium. Well, also these are some, it's in Dutch, but it's like newspapers are constantly full of these messages about air pollution. And about the really bad air quality. Of course, we're also in Belgium, which is one of the hotspots in Europe, also for bad air. Well, together with, I think, north of Italy, of course, is also a hotspot. But also in Belgium, because it's very urbanized, we have a big port which attracts a lot of motorized transport, a lot of trucks, also a lot of industry, which leads to quite bad air. And a few years ago, again, in this pasta project that Luc already talked about, we also asked to people whether they were concerned about the health effects of air pollution. And we did this in these 7 European cities. And the first one here is Antwerp. This is a city in Flanders. And you see that 77% of the people actually indicated that they were worried or extremely worried about the health effects of air pollution. Also people in Rome participated, and also there more than 70% of all participants indicate that they were worried or extremely worried about the health effects of air pollution. And we actually associated these numbers to the actual air pollution. So we took an average by city, and we see it was quite linearly. So the worse the air in your city, the more concerned people are that live in this city. And well, actually they have reasons to be concerned. So this is actually a very good, well, very good. Of course, it's a bad situation, but it's a very good starting point to set up a citizen science campaign, because people are really motivated. And it's not only the highly educated people, but it's really the general public that is interested and that wants to know more, and that even, well, we've seen in this project that even people wanted to pay 10 euros to participate in the project, and still then we had 50,000 people who wanted to participate. So this brings me to the Curieuze Neuze project. So this was the name of the project, and Curieuze Neuze is a Dutch word, and it's actually, it translates as curious noses, and it's actually a saying of people that are curious and they want to stick their nose in other people's business, and they're also quite, well, it's actually a funny name for a project of people that want to use sensors to measure air pollution. And the project had two main aims, and one aim was obviously a scientific aim, which of course was a big scientific project, and we collect a lot of data that is useful for many researchers, and we can publish this research in very high impact journals. But on the other hand, we also had the aim of informing citizens and also raising awareness about issues of air pollution, and also give people tools or knowledge about sources of air pollution, and then give people tools to, well, maybe reduce air pollution in the future. At this point, when we measure air pollution, well, the government measures air pollution, but they do that at some fixed monitoring stations, but they are limited in space. I think in Flanders, there are about 40 to 60 stations, depending on the air pollutant you're looking at. But obviously it's quite limited. So if you live somewhere, then maybe the closest station is 10 kilometers away. And we know that it's not really representative of your personal exposure. So if we want to know air pollution at another location, what we typically do is use air pollution models. So we use these fixed monitoring stations together with other data, like data about the weather, data about traffic streams, and we put this in a computer model. And this results in an air pollution model. And then you have a prediction for maybe your home location or your work location or your school. However, we don't really know how reliable these maps are. We use them and they get validated, but they get validated based on, well, either very small campaigns or using these fixed monitors, but there are only 40 in Flanders. So we don't really know how well these maps perform. So one of the main aims of this Curieuze Neuze project was to collect measurements at very, very many sites, and then use it to validate the model and also to improve the model. So how did we do that? We used these palms types nitrogen dioxide diffusion tubes. So you see it here on the right-hand side. And so those, we always use duplicates. So every participant got 2 of these tubes, and they had to hang it outside of a window at the first floor on the side of the street. And everyone got this panel. It's like a V-shaped panel that they used in real estate as well. And you can just stick it to your window. And the tubes are actually here at the outside, or well, inside, but at the end of the V-shaped panel. And this way we can measure this nitrogen dioxide in a very standardized way in all the participants. And also, well, this is a very easy and accessible way for many people. It does not involve some DIY of sensors, like people have to build them themselves. This is very easy. Everyone can do it. So also to reach a bigger audience, and also to have like, and also this is really a scientific, very well validated method. And it's relatively cheap. But of course, we had to recruit lots of people because we aimed for 20,000 participants. So recruitment of these volunteers was one of the main difficulties, but also main challenges. So at the start of the project, we used very many different channels to make this public. We used print media, because one of the biggest newspapers in Belgium was a sponsor of the project. So they also distributed this widely. There were, short movies in film theaters. There was interviews on radio and TV. There was publicity, Also in public spaces, you can see here a bus that is driving around with some with an ad saying, please register for this project and participate. There were some famous participants, there were social media and so on. And this resulted in quite impressive numbers. When the project was launched, after 3 hours, there were already 4,000 participants that registered in this area. So here you can see Flanders. It's an area of 6 million people. But this 4,000 is quite an impressive number then after 3 hours. After 3 days, they were already 22,000, and after when the recruitment was finished, we had 50,000 locations where people wanted to monitor the air pollution. So from this very big sample, we selected 20,000 sites based on some selection criteria, but of course, we had to disappoint quite some people that could not participate anymore. And well, the main reason was because we were limited by the number of tubes we could buy ourselves. So this was then the whole package that people got. They had to pick it up in April 2018. And it was this measurement package. It included some publicity, like a poster they could hang on their window, saying, hey, I'm participating. And in the end, they could also indicate the result, their personal result. So everyone is walking past the window can see what the result was. Of course, also the tubes, and then an envelope to return the tubes when the measurement campaign ended. So then in May 2018, so 1 month later, the tubes were in place for 4 weeks. We found that 99% of our sample returned to tubes, which is an extremely high number and really shows the motivation of the participants. And this was the main result. So this was a map that was created. And this was also, for example, in the newspaper, there was like a very big extra page with this map showing with all the results and zooming in on certain areas. And it really showed that the main cities like Antwerp here in the middle has a lot of red dots showing very high concentrations, and then compared to more rural areas where you see blue dots having very low concentrations. So you really see like the urban diversity over Flanders that showed up. And this map was really used a lot and people could really identify with this. So about the distribution, so the lowest value we measured was about 10 micrograms per cubic meter, which was in a very rural area. Then the highest value was 75 micrograms, so that's quite high. And then on average, we measured 22 or 23 micrograms per cubic meter. So the majority of the points, as you can see here, was between 15 and 25 micrograms per cubic meter of NO2. So that is already elevated, but we can compare it to the European standard or the WHO guideline, which is 40 micrograms per cubic meter. We see that the majority of the points are below this level, but still 2.3% of people had a measurement that was higher than this value. So about the highest and the lowest point, just to give you an idea, this was actually those two black dots were actually the highest concentrations were measured there. And it's not a typical point. It's not what we expected, in fact, because it's quite a rural area, but this is a very big road and the measurement points were nearby traffic lights. And actually for a big part of the day, there are traffic jams here and stop and go traffic near the traffic lights. And also, as you can see here, it's kind of a street canyon-like design. So that's why there were very high concentrations measured here, and well, kind of unexpected. The lowest point was here. It was the most eastern point in the whole in the whole campaign. It was here. It was very rural area, very nice. No big roads nearby, no industry. only well, planes. So that was the lowest concentration that we measured. It was 11 micrograms per cubic meter. And then what we found was, well, this is a part of Antwerp. And what was particular, when you look at the map, what immediately strikes you is having these street canyon-like designs. So in the streets that have a lot of traffic, but they also, when they're building, the way they build, so there are quite narrow streets and very high buildings next to it. And that really traps the air pollution. There's not a lot of wind. And you really see that concentrations build up there. And that's what really popped out of this map. And also here on maybe, well, even a bit smaller streets, but still because the air is trapped there, that we see very high concentrations. And then what was surprising is that this does not only happen in urban areas, but also in villages, small villages. But you can see that at the main streets, you also have these street canyon-like designs. You have very, very narrow streets with, well, high buildings or and everything next to each other. So no free space, no air that can well, dilute the air pollution. So also in these villages, you had very high concentrations for people living there next to the big axis, and often also with traffic lights, for example. And that was quite surprising for many people that participated. Obviously, one of the aims of the project was to validate the air pollution model, which is a bit more scientific. But what you can see here in this graph is here you can see the measurements, and the measurements on these 20,000 sites are compared to what the model predicts for that site. And then you can calculate or quantify how well these measurements or this model predicts the measurements. And it was, well, it gives an R² of 0.52. That's not really bad, that's not very good, but the most important thing is that they use these results to really improve the model, to see where the model was not performing very well, and they improved the computer model, so now we have a better model based on these measurements. And they really proved that it improved by quantifying this. Obviously, we got a lot of questions after the end of the project of people having high concentrations at their house, and they were worried about the health impact. And then one thing we always told to people is, well, yes, it's not good that you have a high measurement at home, but still you don't spend the whole day at the facade of your house, like the figure on the left side here. You're not breathing that air. You are inside 90% of the time, and you're also not always at home. You spend time at work, you travel. So actually what you inhale is not really what you measured. So this right figure on the right is from a previous study, and there we found out that about 1/3 of your inhaled dose is actually from your time in transport. Another 1/3 is from your time at home. And then another 1/3 is from all other locations that you visit throughout the day. So it's important to know that a bad measurement at home is not necessarily a sign of you experiencing a very severe health impact of this. So if you look again at the map of Curieuzeneuzen, so the result map with the colored dots, you can actually say that your true exposure is, well, if you live here in these green dots, your true exposure goes to the train station in the morning, and then you take the train to go to work, and there at work you cycle to your final destination, and actually your true exposure is then like a weighted average of all the dots that you encounter during your trip, and not only that green dot where your house is. And we also quantified this and made an estimate of this. We call this dynamic exposure. So we calculated an estimate of this, and we also informed participants about this dynamic exposure, because we think it's important for them to have a bit of a framework of what the meaning of a high reading at your house is. And of course, an important part of the project was communication of the results to the participants. As I already said, a newspaper, so the newspaper De Standaard, was one of the main sponsors of the project, and they also brought all the results. So that was really important. Also, of course, the national television reported about this. There were events where we communicated the results and people could really meet the researchers, ask questions about their results. And we also tried to involve schools. So some of the measurement points were actually at schools. And there we had children participating and also, well, being involved with the measurements and having these posters that people had to hang on their window. Also to talk about this with friends, family, children. So it created a lot of buzz about this project, and people were really very aware of what it was. So that's mostly it for me. If you want more information about the project, there is a website, and there's also part of the website is in English. So you can also look at the map there, for example, and explore it. The principal investigator of this project was Philip Meisman from the University of Antwerp. And these were all of the sponsors, because obviously it was a very big project. So thank you for your attention. These are my contact details. So I'm happy to answer any questions, because I think there are quite some similarities with the project you are doing.
Thank you, Evi, very much. It's super interesting. I can just think of also of the question on. Well, first of all, it's very interesting for us, the itinerary that you showed, which indicated that someone did not live in Antwerp, would take a train and not a car, first of all, got on the train and then took a bike at the station to reach their work, which for Italian pattern is absolutely unbelievable. So that's the way we should look forward to, because well, we don't have, for example, just to give you an idea, we don't have cycling stations, bicycle stations in our cities, most of them. So that's, you know, quite a handicap, I would say.
Yes, so, yes, it's actually a bike sharing system that this person used, and it's used quite a lot, especially near the train stations. In the morning, people take a bike there, and in the evening, they got back to the train station. It's actually the quickest way of getting around in the city.
I think we have, okay, we have Lucas that has had to go. And well, I'm not sure if he's still here, but we really thank him very much for being with us. And we also have Luca asking a question. Hi, Evi. How you rebuilt the traveling path to estimate dynamic exposure? Have you asked directly to participants, or it was like an ideal path?
Yes, so no, we did not ask about it. We asked, well, obviously we knew where people were living. We asked about the address of their work location, and also about the mode they most frequently use to go from home to work. And then we actually used Google Maps to retrieve the path. So using that transport mode that they reported. So if they do it in a traffic peak hour, for example, if you enter it in Google Maps, you also know it takes into account traffic jams, for example, and rerouting. But it's not necessarily the path they take, but I think it's a good approximation.
I also have a question. How did you do the poll test, asking the people if they were worried about air pollution? Did you only do one question? Did it come from a university? Did it come from a project, the PASTA project?
Mm-hmm.
How was it designed?
Yes, it was a result from the PASTA project, and it was, well, this specific question about concern was only one question, but it was part of a very large questionnaire. So that's also the reason why it was only one question, because we already had a lot of other questions. It may be that we have attracted a bit more environmentally aware people, so they may be worried a bit more than the general public, but still I think it's really an important sign that people are indeed worried.
Can I ask Luc a question? Luc, have you been working at all in Belgium on the issue of whether the coronavirus can be kind of carried or facilitated by particulate matter? Is anyone working on this?
Not to my knowledge in Belgium, so I know very little about it, and I'm certainly not an expert in it, so I have no idea. So as most of the calculations that I have seen from Eindhoven and also from the US, they assume since the coronavirus is approximately 100 nanometers in size, and then they start to model how a particle of that size would behave in indoor or outdoor environment. But as far as I understand it, the big discussion is it's not just the virus particle itself, it is always in some amount of fluid. And then the discussion is, are these really like small droplets that have a certain speed if you cough or sneeze, and then you can calculate the trajectory that the particle takes, or is it in a much smaller droplet, which is then called an aerosol, and does it spread like an aerosol and then it stays airborne for much longer? And I don't think there's a definitive answer yet. So if it's mainly transferred in the bigger droplets, then it travels only like 1 or 2 meters before it is much lower than your face in any case. And if it's also in an aerosol, then it could travel for many more meters and stay airborne for a longer period. I'm not sure at this point what to believe. In any case, and there are virus particles have been found in these aerosols. So they know that the viral RNA is there, and it's probably also infectious if you want to infect a cell in a laboratory. But if this happens and it happens outdoor, then the amount of volume of air around you is so much larger than if you're in a confined space, because the volume increases like by the 3rd power of the distance between you and the infected person. So even if this is a true possibility of infection, my opinion is likely less important.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know, maybe we have one more question. I have a question. Okay, Elisabetta, maybe. I have a question for Luc. Do you think that wearing certain kind of masks while cycling could effectively avoid breathing polluted air? Do they work? And would they make a difference?
Yes. Okay, thank you for that question. Usually I talk about it in my presentation, and nowadays everyone is suddenly an expert in face masks. So I didn't talk about it today. We've always been opposed to face masks for cyclists for several reasons. And the most important one is like an ethical question, like you put the responsibility not with the one who is emitting the pollutant, but with the one that may get sick. So our idea was you better put a filter on the exhaust pipe rather than a filter over all the mouths and noses of all the other people, because that's just more efficient. Now, the question about whether they work or not, they probably do not work very well for small particles and not at all for gases. And the reason that they don't work very well has some relation to the material they are made of, but especially whether they fit to the face. And I always say jokingly, it doesn't work for people who have a beard. So it's like a question of how well it fits. And all of the tests, and now there are many more tests of face masks during the last month. Most of the tests are done on mannequins. So like they have these plastic dolls that have one fixed head size, and then they fit the mask around it, and then they test the filtration. So these are laboratory conditions. And when you put a face mask on your own face, which is unique, and then moreover you're cycling, so you're breathing, you're moving around, probably there's some leakage. And so that's why we've never been in favor of face masks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I think Luca, do you want to tell the question yourself?
Okay, thank you. Hi Luc, and hi Evi. Thank you for being with us. Yeah, a question to Luc, because yes, of course, it is true that dose is higher for cyclists, but especially inside cities, inside urban areas, it is also true that cyclists usually go faster if compare the same route and if compare cyclists to car owners. So the question is this so time of traveling also a variable to consider if compare when you compare cyclist exposure and those and also car travelers?
Okay, thank you, Luca. That is a really interesting question. Now, before we started doing our experiments, there had been like at least a dozen studies that were measuring the air pollution in a car, on a bicycle, taking exactly the same route. And there have been experiments in several Dutch cities, in Belgian cities. I've seen experiments from London, and always a discussion was, is the air pollution higher in the car or higher on the bicycle? And sometimes it was the car and sometimes it was the bicycle. And that was always if they took exactly the same trajectory. And there was no final conclusion from that. And it's interesting that you say the cyclist is always the fastest, because back then the remark that people always made was, well, but the cyclist is slower and then he will have to cycle for 10 minutes longer, and then he's obviously breathing more air because he's breathing polluted air for a longer time. As if the car driver stops breathing when arriving. So that was a bit fake discussion. Now, the results that I've shown that were from Evi study, if you measure people driving where they want to drive and people cycling where they choose to cycle, then you see lower concentrations for cyclists, because cyclists don't take the same trajectory as the cars. They try to avoid it, both in space, in time, so they prefer more quiet routes, if that's possible, and more quiet times. And that is why in that graph, the air pollution in the vicinity of the cyclists is lower. And so you can lower your exposure when cycling if you actively look for streets that are more quiet or more quiet moments. And that can maybe, depending on the city, lower your exposure with, I don't know, 10%, 20%, maybe 50% if you find a very clean route, but then probably you're making a big detour around the city. But if you're cycling, then you're breathing rate, the amount of air you breathe, is at least 4 times higher, sometimes 10 times higher on average over the entire cycling ride. And so you can never find a route that is 5 times lower in pollution or 10 times lower in pollution. That doesn't exist. So that is why we say the cyclist always inhales a higher dose.
Maybe I can add to that. We're currently also performing an experiment in Brussels where we compare regular cyclists with e-bikes, so electric bicycles. And there you obviously have the advantage that they are quicker and also that you're breathing less because you're, well, of course, it helps you with going quicker and you breathe less. And we also measure breathing there. So I'm very curious about the results, but it could be that could maybe be the best of both worlds. Of you having you bicycle. We know from previous studies that even if you ride an electric bicycle, that it still contributes to your physical activity, while it could lower your breathing and the amount of particles you breathe. So maybe that could help in lowering pollution as well in a way, especially maybe for vulnerable people or older people.
It takes me. So there's someone else asking questions. Oh no, thank you both from Luca. So, well, you know, this is actually, Luc, and Evi, we are recording this. As you have certainly realized, we've had very little time because we decided to start this program of webinars very fast because we are very, very worried that the situation in Italy will be terrible very soon. We have cities deciding to take away low emission zones and people being allowed to each drive whatever car. And this is a very high risk. So we really want to have this webinar program to hopefully be shared and be seen even after today. We still have had almost 50 people attending, so it's very good and it's excellent for in such a short time. And I hope everyone enjoyed it, and we will put your presentation on our website and on and the recording, and we hope that this will be useful for our citizens in Italy to be more aware and more capable of interacting in advocating for cleaner air. I don't know who's Ricky. I've tried several car air pollution filters, and some of them retain up to 50% of PM 2.5 inside the car. Of course, also the bikers can use FFP2 masks. So the best thing is to use the bike if it's possible. Yes, this was just a comment. Okay, so, you know, we're also hopefully launching some proposal, because one thing, now Lucas went away from the Brussels government, but one thing that I'm just puzzled about is how are cities imagining to really cope with the traffic. I mean, you know, cities, if you put everyone on a car, and people won't really, you know, accept to use public transportation from now on, it's in it, at least in Italy, I think it's going to be extremely critical. And I don't, you know, my fear is that there will be very it's going to be very hard to prepare emergency lanes that are so well designed and ready at the right time to be really usable for cities at the right moment. So thank you, Luc, again, and thank you, Evi. Thank you so much for joining us, and grazie a tutti gli altri, e speriamo che vi sia interessato. E we have people from all over Italy, actually, from Venice, from Genova, from many places in Italy. So I think everyone is going away, and thank you again, Luc.
Grazie Anna.
Grazie a voi, grazie a tutti. Bye.
Bye bye. Ciao a tutti.
Thank you, Evi. Thank you so much. Bye. Ciao, Enzo.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. Well, we had a lot of people unexpectedly, in spite of the little advance in time. So thank you very much, Luc. And
thanks again for the invitation. I enjoyed doing it, and I hope this is useful for people in Italy. This is a crisis, but perhaps also a possibility. So in the newspaper The Guardian, there was Marco Granelli, the deputy mayor of Milan, who said, well, our plans for 2030 should now be put in place in 2020. But I don't know whether that is just words or whether he's actually planning to do that.
Maybe we should stop recording. Elisabetta, can you?
Yes, I'll try.